we've never had any clues, really.
She just vanished.
This is the last known spot Erin Gilbert was seen. Her mysterious disappearance still baffles family, friends, and investigators, but they haven't given up on looking for answers. Community members have raised concerns that the posts are harmful, and APD has resisted our efforts to find out if the stories in the posts are based in fact or fiction. Is this accountability?
No.
In any given month during the last 2 years, you could count the number of people walking away from Anchorage's halfway houses on one hand. Some months, no one walked away, but last month, 8 people did. Did you or did you not slap a news reporter?
I will be coming out with a statement later, but for right now, I've no comment on that statement. I haven't fully seen that report, and so I won't make comment without reviewing that report first.
Okay, well, I mean, it's a yes or a no. I mean, did you do it? Is that ever okay? Is that appropriate behavior for a lawmaker, sir?
Can you see why in a school district that's so diverse, the voters would want to know whether you actually said these things?
APD records show it took 53 minutes for police to respond after the family found the suspect and called for help. Do you think the public thinks they're safer than they are?
Oh, most definitely.
What's the end game with the Sinaloa cartel?
I'd be total dismantlement.
Death in Detox, How the System Failed Kelsey Green, a Voices of Alaska investigation.
Good evening. Welcome to our Voices of Alaska special report, Death in Detox. This is a story of how the system failed Kelsey Green. She died in DOC custody in 2016 while detoxing from heroin. We want to warn you, you will see graphic images of how Kelsey spent her final days on this earth here at the Anchorage Correctional Complex. We rarely air images of this nature, but Kelsey's parents have spent years fighting the state and civil court so that you could see them. They wanted to understand what happened to their daughter and why, and now they're sharing her story with you. Before there was an addict, there was an artist, a sister, and a daughter.
Who was Kelsey?
She was a wonderful little girl.
Kelsey was a nut. Kelsey was very animated. She loved animals. She loved music. She loved to play the guitar. She loved people.
She ran into problems in her teenage years.
Kathy and John Green, Kelsey's parents, say Kelsey was raped as a teen. They took her to counseling, and she changed schools twice. But she eventually started using marijuana to cope.
How did she start using? She was at her apartment, and she had some friends over, and they asked her if she wanted to try to smoke some hash. And she thought she was smoking hash. And evidently it was heroin, and she liked the feeling, and that's how she started.
Before long, their little girl, who was terrified of needles, had an insatiable need to inject heroin.
We tried all over the valley to get her help to get off of this stuff, and there was no openings anywhere.
Kelsey knew she was an addict. She knew she didn't want to be an addict.
After years of failed attempts to get her help, Kathy knew she couldn't let Kelsey come home.
I had put my gun underneath the couch in the living room, and I reached down there to get it, and pulled it out, and the gun was missing. So I called her dad.
Kelsey had a warrant out for her arrest. She had been caught driving with a suspended license and hadn't finished her court-ordered community service in that case.
We thought that if she went to jail that they could help her get off the drugs, and then we could go from there.
At her parents' request, Kelsey was arrested on January 5th. Her booking paperwork shows she reported her recent heroin use, but she had to request to be put on detox protocol the next day. By the 8th, Kelsey reported she was vomiting blood. She was taken to medical and given a liter of IV fluid, then returned to her cell, even though she wanted to stay in medical segregation. According to DOC records, Kelsey's call button was pushed multiple times on the 9th. During a lineup, she appears barely able to stand, instead slumps against the wall. She continued to report being dehydrated and unable to stop vomiting, but she was never taken to medical that day. Instead, she is seen returning from a shower, unclothed, collapsing on her bed. Other inmates help her get back to her cell. Overnight, corrections officers again must respond to the call button. Kelsey can't stop vomiting. The supervisor decides to move her to a cell by herself, a choice the family's attorney says was a critical one.
We were informed by her cellmates here that it was the fact that they kept hitting the call button saying, hey, she's dying, she's really sick, you know, she needs to go to medical, she can't stay here, you gotta go to medical. They say that's what prompted the 4 a.m. room change.
Okay.
In depositions for the family's civil suit against the state, a DOC employee admitted it is not a best practice to leave a detoxing patient alone.
I would have recommended her not to move her into a cell by herself.
And why is that?
Because detox patients are always better with a cellmate.
Okay, why?
Because the other cellmate can actually watch the other person in case there's a problem and hit the button. If the person's having an issue and can't hit the button, you can't help them.
Less than 6 hours after the cell change, a corrections officer making his rounds found Kelsey dead.
She was found against the door underneath the call button. She had taken off her clothes at some point in time, had gotten off the bed, crawled over to the underneath the call button, was unable to reach it to call for help, and was found cold, stiff, her eyes open.
Rigor mortis had already set in, freezing Kelsey's arms above her head.
I always let her stay with me. And then I end up being the one that called the cops. So that's a hard thing to live with.
After 3 years of civil litigation, John and Kathy reached an agreement with the state. The two are divorced, but were united in their fight for answers and accountability. It's not a settlement, but rather an offer of judgment. The state's attorneys offered to accept a judgment against the state for the maximum amount of $400,000.
They were wrong. They were mean, they were cruel. My daughter suffered. Suffered.
Her cause of death was dehydration, renal failure, and heart dysrhythmia. But before she left jail on a gurney, Kelsey's mom says her daughter had bigger plans. She wanted to tell high school students what addiction is really like.
And what it does to you and how terrible it is. All you can think about is that next one, and then if you don't get it, then the terrible pain you go through, and the sweating, the throwing up, the hurting of your bones, just everything. She wanted to let people know what it's really like.
In her death, Kathy and John have become advocates, pushing for better access to detox and rehabilitation resources in Alaska.
What can happen? That paper underneath there, that says deceased, man. You know, if we don't fix that, that's what parents have to look forward to.
It's the last picture taken of Kelsey alive. The story she might have told had she lived, we'll never know. Now it's the story of how she died that her parents hope will spark change. In a statement, the DOC said shortly after Kelsey's death, the department adopted a new detoxification order set, and there have been no in-custody deaths due to detoxing from opiates since that change. When we come back,
there's proof. I pray that they do the right thing.
John and Kathy won their civil case, but they're still pushing for criminal charges. The state's been having problems keeping track of these guys, Kyle Andrews and Kennedy Talley, both violent assault suspects. This is video of Talley at his victim's doorstep with a gun. Both were released on the state's pretrial GPS monitoring, but when they violated their conditions within hours of being released, instead of being tracked and rearrested, they got phone calls and more freedom.
Never, not once, ever is it okay. It's that simple.
We sat down with the experts, representatives from the remaining 3 private electronic monitoring companies in Alaska.
My question to them would be, why do you have this monitor on them if you don't go and find them before it dies.
Glenn Hamby with Alaska Defendant Monitoring, Dennis Johnson with Alaska Pretrial Services, and Matthew Baskett with Pioneer Peak Monitoring say there's no reason why a suspect released on a GPS tracker should be unaccounted for days.
What can happen in that time?
I mean, literally anything can happen in that time.
Since he has a victim, he can go right to the victim's house and nobody's going to pay attention. Well, PED's not paying attention.
We learned about the problems from the state's own records, warrants filed by the Pretrial Enforcement Division, or PED.
Is this accountability?
No way, shape, or form.
All right, what you like your device says?
With the help of a KTVA employee, they're going to show us how GPS monitoring should work.
All right, good luck, guys.
He gets a head start to head toward a hiding place of his choice.
Okay, our device is on the move now.
And soon, we're en route to find him.
We're just now departing his inclusion zone, which would have been KTVA. What route of travel do you have for him?
He went west on 24th Avenue.
I think rather than go in my apartment, we're going to check out the area behind there.
The accuracy is within 20 feet right now. It appears that he may be behind the building or he may be inside the building.
Got it. If you see any changes in the movement of the traces, call us.
Okay, we'll do.
I'll take this side. You want to take that side?
Hey, bud. How's it going? They got it. You guys got me.
Our smiling suspect now in custody. They show us another tool they can use for suspects who are harder to find.
There's absolutely no reason whatsoever that if we have somebody who's violated, PED or private, that we should not be putting ourselves out there for what we've agreed to do.
We made repeated attempts to speak with the PED or someone at the Department of Corrections for this story. The DOC sent a statement admitting errors were made, but would not agree to an interview.
I believe they 100% owe everybody an explanation of what's going on, because pre-PED 2018, my company would be shut down for that right there.
By the state?
By the state. One of those. No judge would ever give me another person to monitor if I did that.
Suspects continue to be released to PED supervision and will continue to ask questions, because if public safety is at risk, Alaskans need to know. So something you don't see in that video, because it was just a demonstration, is something called a victim notification. They all told me that if a defendant violates their conditions of release, the very first call made is a call to the victim. And Joe and Megan, I can tell you in Kennedy Talley's case, his victim told me PED did not notify her that they had no idea where he was.
The governor says Alaska law requires his silence when it comes to personnel issues. Our investigative reporter Daniella Rivera spoke with two legal experts who say in this case, that's simply not true.
This legal debate began when the Anchorage Daily News and ProPublica uncovered hundreds of, quote, uncomfortable text messages Clarkson sent to a female employee in March. That investigation caused Clarkson to reveal he'd been placed on unpaid leave. But until then, his punishment had been a well-kept state secret. When the messages became public, Clarkson abruptly resigned. Our investigative team has repeatedly asked the governor to talk with us about how he handled things and why the public was kept in the dark.
Okay, our second question comes from Daniella Rivera, also from Alaska's news source.
Governor Mike Dunleavy's news conference on September 1st, a week after AG Kevin Clarkson resigned, was the first opportunity for journalists to directly question the governor about what happened.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. Governor, Alaskans are concerned about how you handle the Attorney General's inappropriate text messages. They want to know what you knew, when you knew it, and what exactly you did to address the AG's behavior.
That issue was dealt with according to law, and there are statutes that allow and prohibit certain comments on that. And so once again, if that's a question you want to answer, you can send it to our press. They'll screen it through our Department of Law to make sure that the answers that are given are in conjunction with allowable, applicable law to actually talk about that issue.
Then Press Secretary Jeff Turner reminds reporters to stick to questions about the pandemic.
Please, if you have questions on a different topic, As the governor said, we're happy to respond to those. Just send me an email and we'll get responses to you as quickly as possible.
That's exactly what we did. Investigative reporter Jill Burke emailed multiple requests to Turner asking for an interview with the governor, explaining we wanted to ask about what the governor knew, when he knew it, and what actions were taken, as well as why Alaskans were kept in the dark that the state's top law enforcement official had been placed on leave. Turner's reply, the governor won't be conducting any interviews, citing a law that makes unemployment discrimination complaints confidential. Our investigative unit asked that the governor reconsider, pointing out that the questions are directly aimed at accountability in government, and that the governor should answer when he first learned about the situation with A.J. Clarkson and what steps were taken. We also stated that as the state's top legal authority, the Attorney General is subject to higher levels of public scrutiny. And we pointed out Clarkson himself had already made details of his departure public, describing what happened in the lengthy resignation letter he sent to Alaska's news source and other media. Turner again cited the same law, saying the complaint process and investigation are confidential.
It sounds like they're grasping at straws, frankly.
Adam Marshall, an attorney with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, said that statute doesn't apply here.
I litigate public records cases all across the country, and the law that is being cited is essentially an exemption to disclosing records under the public records law. That has nothing to do with whether or not the governor can give an interview.
Does this law prevent the governor from sitting down and talking about his own actions?
Not at all. It simply doesn't.
We also sat down with John McKay, who has practiced media law in Alaska for decades.
The reasons that they've given simply don't apply. I mean, I think it's the kind of thing, if they wanted to say, look, we just don't feel like talking about this, it's an embarrassment, or we don't really feel like the public needs to know anything more about this, we've taken care of it, none of your business, nothing to see here, move on. You know, they could say that.
While state personnel records are typically confidential, McKay says that's not the case for the position of Attorney General.
But Mr. Clarkson was not a confidential classified employee. He was what they call exempt employee. And the law treats exempt employees differently, and the personnel rules don't apply to them.
According to Alaska statutes, the head of each principal department in the executive branch is exempt from the confidentiality portion of the state's personnel code. That includes Clarkson, who was the head of the Department of Law.
I think there's a misnomer that anything that has to do with personnel matters is somehow something that the public doesn't have any right to know about, and that's simply not true.
Turner has also said that the AG's resignation removed any possibility of another incident. But Clarkson didn't resign until his misconduct was made public, and we want to ask about that too.
Why was he going to be allowed to come back to work until the public found out about this?
I think those are perfectly legitimate questions that have nothing to do with any arguably confidential process of investigating a complaint that may or may not have been filed.
Governor Dunleavy hasn't held a news conference since September 1st when I asked about Clarkson. Instead, his administration has held town hall events, encouraging Alaskans to submit questions to be selected by the governor's staff. The governor has said he values the public's trust in its government.
We must restore public trust in government and elected officials. That's what my plan was last year, and that's my plan now. We'll be back next week.
But a month later, those questions remain unanswered.
Here's Daniella Rivera with Beautiful Soul.
Shauna Yvonne's case went cold quickly. There wasn't much to go on. What was a crime scene 29 years ago is a parking lot today. Shauna's immediate family members have all passed away, but her friends remember her smile, how it could light up a room. And they want her killer brought to justice. When 12-year-old Shauna Yvonne disappeared in April of 1991, she was considered a runaway.
After she came home, changed clothes, left with a friend, I didn't see her again.
Shauna's mother, Rose Yvonne, reported her missing. 6 weeks later, she learned Shauna had been murdered.
I just don't know why this is happening and why it would happen to my daughter.
Whoever killed Shauna tried to hide her body. She was found in the back doorway of an abandoned building near 6th Avenue and C Street. Her decomposing remains found lying under trash, a street sign, and a wooden pallet piled on top of her. Her cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head.
I never thought this would happen to my daughter, and if I had known, I would have had her carry things that could protect her.
Shauna left her village on Nunivak Island in the middle of the Bering Sea and moved to Anchorage to finish school.
We were both in 7th grade at Clark Junior High School.
She and Lena Austin became fast friends.
She just came in the room and she had like this biggest smile on her face like she always did. And we just became friends right then and there.
Shauna was known to her friends and family as Twinkie.
I don't know why she ended up with Twinkie. It's probably because she ate so many of them.
But adjusting to life in a big city takes time, and Shauna's life would soon be cut short. Shauna succumbed to culture shock in the city, according to Anchorage Daily News Archives. The paper reported on her funeral service in Anchorage before she was taken to Bethel for burial. Shauna's cousin sang Jesus Loves Me. The pastor lamented what might have been. She wanted to travel, he said. She wanted to experience life. Exactly 1 year after her body was found, APD investigators said they'd reached a dead end in the case. After Shauna went missing, her mother walked the streets, putting up handwritten signs announcing her daughter as a missing person. But by 2002, more than a decade later, police had lost contact with Shauna's family. The crime scene, now an empty field. But APD homicide detective Glenn Klinkart had continued to work Shauna's case.
My examination so far of the case indicates that there were a lot of suspects. In fact, that may have been one of the problems, is that everybody had a theory about what happened to poor Shauna.
Still, he had high hopes of finding her killer using new technology.
DNA. As well as new fingerprinting techniques. So we're going to be looking at that, especially trace evidence, those items that were left there that the killer may have left.
But time marched on, and whatever evidence existed did not resolve the case. Detective Klinkart left APD, and Shauna's murder remains unsolved. We asked the Anchorage Police Department to discuss Shauna's case with us for this report. Our requests were denied, with police saying the nearly 3 decades-old case is an open investigation.
30 years later, and the person who did it to her hasn't been caught.
There are plenty of happy memories of Shauna, but talking about her case opens up an old wound for those who remember what it was like to lose her.
That someone could do that to her and hid her body underneath a board, and that she had been beaten so bad into her head, and that's what killed her. And then hid her body in that stairwell. And I know it was years ago, but it was just like the worst thing we ever went through.
Lena remains friends with others who knew and loved Shauna and says none of them have given up hope they'll see her killer brought to justice.
We want to know because, you know, we were her friends. And like I said, I haven't heard from any of the detectives in probably about 10 years.
Time has done little to fade Shauna's memory in the hearts of those who loved her.
If she would be here right now, you'd probably see how wonderful she was.
Her name is now etched in stone at the Homicide Victims Memorial in downtown Anchorage, and her portrait is preserved thanks to the work of a Dillingham artist.
I don't know that much about her, but I can see that she's just a beautiful little girl, and she should have had a life.
Amber Webb created an oversized cuspbook bearing the names and faces of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Shauna's bright smile is at the center.
The pain that I felt in drawing her portrait was that there was no darkness there. It was just like pure light, like a child would have. There's always light reflection in people's eyes, and her light reflection looked like stars. And I remember trying to make sure that I got those stars in there.
The cuspbook is now on display at the Anchorage Museum, yards away from where Shauna was found.
And I think that project is calling out justice for all Native women, not just the women on that project and not just women who've been killed.
When Amber looks at Shauna's portrait, she sees generations of Indigenous people whose stories are untold, people who also knew the violence that cut Shauna's life short.
Women have been fighting for for justice for 40 years, 50 years, but it's only now that things are starting to really move. And I just imagine if people had been listening, 50 years ago, she wouldn't have been killed. She would have had a different life,
It's impossible to know what Shauna's life could have become had she not been robbed of the chance to grow up.
She was an innocent kid who had a golden heart, and she trusted anybody.
Her mother, Rose, hoped for answers that didn't come in her lifetime.
There's just a handful of us friends that knew her.
And just a few left to fight for justice for Shauna.
I feel like it's been forgotten.
Why do you feel like it's been forgotten?
Because it happened so long ago, and I hate to say this, but because she's Native.
More than a name, a face, and now a case number.
She was a beautiful soul. She was precious.